In 1870, Great Britain controlled nearly one-third of all manufacturing on Earth. By 1945, the United States produced more than half of everything the world made. Today, China manufactures 28% of global output, more than the next three nations combined. These numbers represent something far more powerful than economic statistics. They map the architecture of global power itself, revealing how nations transform production capacity into geopolitical dominance that reshapes the world order for generations. Manufacturing dominance creates dependencies that function like invisible chains, binding other nations to your industrial system. Throughout history, the nation that controls what the world needs gains leverage that transcends military might or diplomatic influence. Manufacturing dominance creates dependencies that function like invisible chains, binding other nations to your industrial system. The country that makes what others cannot live without holds power that operates silently, constantly, reshaping global politics without firing a single shot. This pattern repeats across centuries with mathematical precision. When you control critical supply chains, you control the nations that depend on them. When those nations need your products to power their economies, defend their territories, or maintain their standard of living, you possess leverage that diplomacy alone could never create. The mechanism is deceptively simple. Build manufacturing capacity that others cannot match, then create products essential to modern life. Watch as dependencies form naturally as other nations hollow out their own production capabilities in pursuit of cheaper goods. Then, when geopolitical interests diverge, those dependencies transform into pressure points that can be activated without warning. What makes this weapon particularly effective is its dual nature. Supply chains operate as economic benefit during peacetime, lowering costs and raising living standards. But they simultaneously function as strategic vulnerabilities, hidden tripwires embedded in the global economy. Nations willingly create these dependencies because the economic logic appears sound, only discovering the strategic cost when it's far too late to reverse course. The invisible empire operates precisely because it looks like simple commerce. The pattern emerged in its purest form during Britain's Industrial Revolution. Between 1750 and 1870, Britain transformed from a minor manufacturing power into the undisputed workshop of the world. By the 1860s, British factories produced approximately 32% of global manufacturing output, a dominance unmatched in human history. The foundation of this power rested on cotton textiles. In 1750, India dominated global textile production, its hand-woven cotton fabrics renowned across continents. By 1825, British mechanized mills had reversed this equation completely. Britain imported raw cotton from its colonies, processed it through water-powered mills and steam-driven machines, then exported finished textiles back to the very regions that once dominated the trade. This reversal demonstrated manufacturing power in action. Britain didn't just make textiles more efficiently, it systematically dismantled India's textile industry through a combination of protective tariffs, captive colonial markets, and overwhelming production capacity. By 1850, India's share of world manufacturing had collapsed from 25% to barely 8%, while British manufactured goods flooded global markets from Buenos Aires to Bombay. The strategic implications extended far beyond economics. Nations that depended on British manufactured goods, textiles, machinery, iron products, and coal found themselves locked into Britain's economic orbit. They needed British steam engines to industrialize, British ships to trade, British capital to finance development. These dependencies translated directly into political influence, creating an informal empire of economic relationships that reinforced Britain's formal colonial holdings. By 1870, Britain accounted for approximately 1/4 of global trade, despite representing less than 3% of world population. The British pound became the world's reserve currency because nations needed sterling to purchase British goods. The Royal Navy protected shipping lanes because global commerce depended on British manufacturing exports. Economic dominance and geopolitical power merged into a single self-reinforcing system. But the pattern also revealed its inevitable weakness. Manufacturing dominance creates complacency. Britain's competitors studied British methods, imported British machinery, recruited British engineers. Germany and the United States invested in newer factories, better technology, larger scale production. By 1913, Britain's share of global manufacturing had fallen to 14%, overtaken by both rivals. The workshop of the world had taught the world how to manufacture. The students eventually surpassed the teacher, demonstrating that manufacturing dominance is always temporary, always vulnerable to competitors willing to invest in catching up. The pattern repeated with America's rise to manufacturing supremacy during World War II. Between 1940 and 1945, American manufacturing output tripled as the nation became the arsenal of democracy. The United States produced 296,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 2.4 million trucks, 5,600 cargo ships, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition during the war years. By 1945, America manufactured more than half of all goods produced globally. This dominance didn't emerge from superior technology alone, but from deliberate industrial mobilization on an unprecedented scale. Real GDP grew 72% between 1940 and 1945, with more than 40% of GDP devoted to national defense by 1944. The United States held roughly 2/3 of global gold reserves and accounted for over 1/3 of total world exports by war's end. This manufacturing supremacy translated directly into geopolitical dominance that shaped the post-war order. American production capacity enabled the Marshall Plan, rebuilt Allied economies, and underwrote the military alliances that contained Soviet expansion. The dollar became the world's reserve currency because global trade required American manufactured goods. For 3 decades following World War II, American manufacturing dominance appeared unshakable, but the pattern held. Competitors studied American methods, invested in newer technologies, and gradually closed the gap. The pattern reemerged with shocking speed in the 21st century. When China joined the World Trade Organization in December 2001, its manufacturing exports totaled approximately $266 billion annually. By 2024, that figure exceeded $3.5 trillion, representing roughly 15% of global exports. In just 2 decades, China accomplished what took Britain a century. The numbers tell a story of unprecedented manufacturing growth. In 2000, China accounted for 6% of global manufacturing output. By 2023, that share reached 28%, valued at $4.66 trillion in value-added production. China now produces more manufactured goods than the United States, Japan, and Germany combined. The United Nations projects that by 2030, China will control 45% of global manufacturing value added, a level of dominance exceeding even Britain's Victorian peak. This dominance extends across virtually every industrial sector. China produces over 75% of the world's lithium-ion batteries, controlling the supply chain from raw material processing through final assembly. It manufactures 70% of global cathode materials and 85% of anode materials, both critical battery components. For rare earth elements essential to everything from smartphones to guided missiles, China controls approximately 90% of global processing capacity. The strategic implications mirror and exceed those of Britain's industrial empire. When Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company produces 90% of the world's most advanced computer chips, Taiwan gains geopolitical leverage that transforms a small island into a strategic asset that major powers cannot ignore. When China dominates solar panel production at 80% of global capacity, it influences the pace and direction of the entire world's energy transition. Consider the dependencies this creates. European automobile manufacturers discovered during the 2020 semiconductor shortage that they couldn't produce vehicles without chips made in Taiwan. American defense contractors found that critical weapon systems relied on rare earth magnets processed exclusively in China. These weren't hypothetical vulnerabilities, but actual production halts, billion-dollar losses, strategic capabilities degraded by supply chain dependencies that had formed gradually, invisibly, over decades of globalization. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed these vulnerabilities with brutal clarity. Between 2020 and 2023, the global semiconductor shortage demonstrated how deeply modern economies depend on concentrated manufacturing capacity. Automotive production fell by millions of vehicles, while consumer electronics faced year-long delays. The shortage cost the global economy an estimated $240 billion in lost output, entirely because critical components came from a small number of facilities concentrated in East Asia. This concentration isn't accidental, but the result of deliberate industrial policy. While Western nations pursued financial services and technology, China invested over $150 billion in semiconductor manufacturing through its Made in China 2025 initiative. While American companies outsourced production to reduce costs, Chinese firms built complete supply chains from raw materials to finished products. The economic logic appeared sound in isolation, but the cumulative effect created dependencies that now constrain American and European strategic options. The weaponization has already begun. In October 2025, China imposed new export controls on rare earth processing technology and magnets, containing even 0.1% Chinese origin materials. This single policy affects virtually every advanced technology product globally, from electric vehicles to wind turbines to military systems. China didn't need to cut off exports completely. The mere threat of restrictions grants negotiating leverage over every nation dependent on these materials. Similarly, China's economic coercion against Lithuania in 2021 demonstrated supply chain weaponization in action. When Lithuania allowed Taiwan to open a representative office, China didn't just restrict Lithuanian exports, It pressured multinational corporations to remove Lithuanian components from their supply chains, effectively cutting off Lithuania's access to global markets. The message was clear. Economic integration creates vulnerabilities that can be exploited for political purposes. The invisible chains become visible only when they're pulled tight. The United States has belatedly recognized these vulnerabilities. Since 2020, reshoring and nearshoring initiatives have grown from generating 11,000 jobs annually to over 300,000 in 2022. The CHIPS and Science Act allocated $52 billion to rebuild domestic semiconductor manufacturing. These efforts represent the largest industrial policy push since World War II, driven by the recognition that manufacturing dependence equals strategic vulnerability. But reversing decades of industrial hollowing out proves extraordinarily difficult. U.S. manufacturing employment peaked at 19.6 million workers in 1979 and fell to 12.8 million by 2019, a decline of 35%. The knowledge, supply chains, and industrial ecosystems that enabled American manufacturing dominance largely evaporated. Rebuilding requires not just factory construction, but workforce training, supplier networks, and technical expertise that take years or decades to develop. The pattern reveals itself again. Just as Britain discovered that manufacturing dominance is temporary, so too will China face competitors. India, Vietnam, Mexico, and others are building manufacturing capacity, offering alternatives to Chinese production. But the transition period creates maximum vulnerability, when dependencies remain high while alternatives stay underdeveloped. That's precisely where the world finds itself today. The workshop of the world faces challenges from students learning the lessons Britain and America learned before. The trajectory points toward increasing economic fragmentation and strategic competition centered on supply chain control. The era of frictionless globalization has ended, replaced by a world where manufacturing capacity directly determines geopolitical power. Every major nation now treats supply chain security as a matter of national security, fundamentally altering how global trade operates. This shift manifests in measurable ways. Foreign direct investment increasingly flows toward friend-shoring, relocating production to allied nations rather than seeking lowest costs globally. Trade agreements now include provisions for supply chain resilience, privileging security over pure efficiency. Industrial policy, once considered economically backward, has returned as governments recognize that market forces alone won't secure strategic industries. The economic costs are substantial. Fragmenting global supply chains reduces efficiency, increases redundancy, and raises consumer prices. Estimates suggest that complete supply chain decoupling between the United States and China could reduce global GDP by 5%, equivalent to roughly $5 trillion in lost output annually. But nations increasingly view these costs as acceptable compared to the strategic vulnerability of concentrated dependencies. Security trumps efficiency when supply chains become weapons. The pattern suggests several potential outcomes. First, manufacturing capacity will increasingly concentrate in regional blocks rather than single nations. North American supply chains linking the United States, Mexico, and Canada will compete with European supply chains, reducing dependence on Asia. Asian supply chains centered on China will face competition from Southeast Asian alternatives. These regional systems will compete for dominance, creating multiple centers of manufacturing power rather than a single workshop of the world. The globe fractures along economic fault lines. Second, critical industries will face persistent pressure toward nationalization or friend-shoring. Semiconductors provide the template, too strategically important to leave concentrated in potentially hostile nations. Expect similar dynamics for batteries, rare earth processing, pharmaceutical manufacturing, and advanced materials. The list will expand as nations recognize new vulnerabilities in their supply chains. Third, technological innovation will determine which nations can compete in this new environment. Advanced manufacturing technologies, automation, artificial intelligence, additive manufacturing promise to reduce the labor cost advantage that drove offshoring. Nations that master these technologies can potentially manufacture competitively, even with higher wages. This technological competition will determine economic leadership in the coming decades, but the pattern also warns of dangers. Supply chain weaponization creates incentives for conflict rather than cooperation. When manufacturing capacity determines geopolitical power, controlling production becomes a strategic objective worth fighting to achieve or prevent. Taiwan's semiconductor dominance makes the island a flashpoint precisely because those chips are strategically essential. Rare earth deposits in disputed territories become worth military confrontation when control over processing capacity translates to economic leverage. The invisible empire can generate very visible wars. Economic history suggests that periods of fragmentation and competition over strategic resources correlate with increased conflict risk. The 1930s saw trading blocs and autarky policies that contributed to World War II. The Cold War created separate economic systems that reinforced military rivalry. Today's supply chain competition could follow similar patterns if nations view manufacturing control as zero-sum competition rather than potential cooperation. The dependencies we've created won't disappear quickly. Even aggressive reshoring efforts require decades to rebuild industrial capacity. During this vulnerable transition period, the nation that currently controls supply chains, China, possesses maximum leverage. How it chooses to use that leverage and how dependent nations respond will shape the geopolitical landscape for the next generation. The conventional narrative treats globalization as an irreversible march toward economic integration. Supply chains, distributed across dozens of nations, products assembled from components sourced globally, efficiency maximized through specialization and comparative advantage. This narrative assumes that economic interdependence creates peace through mutual benefit, that nations won't disrupt systems that make everyone wealthier. History teaches a different lesson. Manufacturing dominance has always been temporary, always contested, always weaponized when strategic interests diverge from economic logic. The question isn't whether supply chains will be used as tools of geopolitical power, but how aggressively and how soon. Every previous dominant manufacturer eventually faced the choice between protecting its advantages and accepting decline as competitors caught up. China now faces that choice. It possesses manufacturing dominance comparable to Britain in 1870 or America in 1945, creating dependencies that translate directly into geopolitical leverage. But those dependencies also create incentives for other nations to reduce their vulnerability, to rebuild domestic capacity, to create alternative supply chains that bypass Chinese control. The more aggressively China weaponizes its manufacturing dominance, the faster those alternatives will emerge. The invisible empire becomes visible, and visibility breeds resistance. The contrarian insight is that supply chain dominance contains its own termination. The very dependencies that create power also motivate others to escape that power. The more effectively you use manufacturing as a geopolitical weapon, the more urgently your rivals will work to neutralize it. Britain's industrial empire taught competitors how to industrialize. American manufacturing dominance funded the research that enabled foreign competitors. Chinese manufacturing dominance is now driving the largest industrial policy push in Western history. What endures across all these transitions is the fundamental pattern. The nation that makes what others need possesses power that operates independently of military force or diplomatic influence. But that power is always temporary, always vulnerable to competitors willing to invest in catching up. Manufacturing dominance shapes the world, but never permanently. The workshop of the world is always a temporary title. The world we're entering will be defined by this competition, not wars over territory or ideology, but struggles over who controls the supply chains that power modern civilization. The factories that make batteries, chips, rare earth magnets, and pharmaceuticals will determine which nations rise and which decline. The invisible empire of supply chains will shape geopolitics as profoundly as any military force. We've been here before. The pattern repeats, because manufacturing power is too valuable to leave unchallenged and too difficult to maintain indefinitely. Understanding this pattern doesn't change the competition, but it clarifies what we're competing over and why the stakes are so high. The supply chain empire operates around us every day, unseen but absolutely decisive. Recognizing it transforms how we understand power in the modern world.